Hello to everyone in the Word on Fire Institute family. Welcome back to another Evangelization and Culture Live, our live seminars we put on a regular basis to have conversations on issues and topics that are at the forefront of culture or deeply embedded on important questions that you need to know about in order to become the best evangelist possible. We are delighted to be joined by Dr. Tod Worner. Dr. Tod Worner, who maybe you already know well, is the head of our Journal of Evangelization and Culture, and he also runs our podcast on evangelization and culture. Many of you already received that journal. It's really one of the jewels in the crown of the Word on Fire Institute. And he is here to give us a seminar on Churchill and Hitler, Lessons in Faith from the Rhetoric of War. Day one is the rise of Titanic Oratory. The Rise of Titanic Oratory, which is a fantastic title and also the most Dr. Tod Worner title I could possibly be reading right now. You are in for a treat. As I always ask, please open up that chat box at the very bottom of your screen. Introduce yourself, and you'll see that the Word on Fire Institute family is from all over the world. Of course, this is a conversation. So as Dr. Tod is giving his presentation, please feel free to put in your questions, to engage each other in questions. We'll be monitoring the chat, and we'll be spending a good time towards the end of the lecture to engage with you. We're on day one. We're also going to have day two as well to wrap things up. I also want to say a welcome to all of you who are joining us on our Word on Fire Institute YouTube channel. We're also monitoring the chat there as well. So please feel free to put your questions. And if you want to watch day two and all of the other offerings that we have on the Word on Fire Institute platform, just visit institute.wordonfire.org for a free 30-day subscription. With that, let's get Dr. Tod up here for the Rise of Titanic Oratory. He's going to give us an example of that oratory as well.
Thanks, Matt.
Welcome.
Thank you. I realize that when I work for Dr. Matt Perchusik, I have to use big vocabulary to justify my existence with Word on Fire. So thanks so much, Matt, for being here. Thanks for moderating. And also thanks to the great production crew for making this what is just going to be a wonderfully produced show. Just bear with the teacher as you go. So as Matt said, this is Churchill and Hitler, Lessons in Faith from the Rhetoric of War. Day one, Churchill and Hitler, the Rise of Titanic Oratory. So let's begin. When I was a young boy, I'd wander through my parents' home library and thumb through shelves teeming with books. Now, while it wasn't an exquisite library, ornately hewed from weighty oak or cherry wood, it was fashioned for function. To learn, I was taught you must read. And to read, you must have an abundance of books from which to choose. In his collection, Thoughts and Adventures, Winston Churchill would reflect on the dilemma of possessing too many books. He wrote, quote, "What shall I do with all my books?" was the question, and the answer, read them, sobered the questioner. But if you cannot read them, at any rate, handle them, and as it were, fondle them, peer into them, let them fall open where they will. Read on from the first sentence that arrests the eye, then turn to another. Make a voyage of discovery, taking soundings of uncharted seas, set them back on your shelves with your own hands, arrange them to your own plan, so that if you do not know what is in them, you at least know where they are. If they cannot be your friends, let them be at any rate your acquaintances. If they cannot enter the circle of your life, do not deny them at least a nod of recognition, close quote. Forgive me, I'm just going to enter our code here to get the pictures back up. And so in handling, peering into, and allowing these books in my family library to fall open where they would, I came across the spine of a menacing book staring back at me. It was a thick doorstop book with a faded black dust jacket. In its center was a perfect white circle housing a twisted cross. The symbol, I came to learn, was a swastika, and the book was William Shirer's The Rise and the Fall of the Third Reich. Now, briefly, I'm going to say this. I think almost every person of my generation had parents that had The Rise and the Fall of the Third Reich in their library. It was just this oversized tome, and it cataloged what happened in the rise and the fall of Hitler's Nazi Germany. But at that time, I knew nothing, but this book was stark and, again, somewhat menacing. So I approached my father about this book, and I asked him, what's the Third Reich? What does this mean? This would begin what has become a lifelong conversation about the darkness of Adolf Hitler, the ideology of National Socialism, and the horrors unleashed in both international war and domestic genocide. For a time, I began reading everything I could get my hands on about the Nazis. I was endlessly shocked and irretrievably confused about how a man and his movement could captivate a sophisticated people and lead them into the blackest perdition. How could this happen, I wondered? How could they do this? It was a few years later that I began to see another name emerge time and again in opposition to Adolf Hitler. This figure, however, was not German, but was British. Where Hitler was lean, this man was pudgy. Where Hitler was dour and humorless, this man possessed a rapier-like wit. But what did they have in common? They had in common captivating oratory and a ferocious defense of their own beliefs. This man, Hitler's greatest nemesis, was of course Winston S. Churchill. Now, as Hitler rose and devoured nations, at first bloodlessly and then in war, leaders faltered and fumbled, dissembled and appeased, but not Winston Churchill. As Hitler declared an ideology of ruthless might and racial superiority, Churchill instead championed Christian civilization and the dignity of man. As Hitler seethed forward in making his ill-gotten gains, Churchill bellowed "stop" with a determination to repulse a monster. Now, to be sure, Churchill did all of this with deft political maneuvering and an unorthodox military strategy, but above all, he did it with words. In an age that believes oratory no longer matters, Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill proved that words can move the world to the abyss, and words could bring us back home. In this first session, I intend to explore how Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill became such capable orators, examine the power of the newly anointed Führer, and the powerlessness of the wilderness Churchill in the 1930s, and explore the rising rhetoric of Hitler in defense of National Socialism, countered by the incisive speeches of Churchill championing British democracy. This lecture will draw from Hitler's speeches of the 1930s surrounding the reoccupation of the Rhineland, the takeover of Austria, and the threat over the Sudetenland that culminated in the Munich Pact and beyond. And also we will discuss Churchill's lonely but resolute speeches diagnosing Hitler's evil and courageously rebutting his dark intent. So let's begin. Let's begin with Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was the son of Lord Randolph Churchill, an aristocrat, a descendant, though not a firstborn, of the famous Duke of Marlborough, who found his way in conservative politics. A rising star in the British House of Commons, Randolph was known as an arresting speaker. Handsome and charismatic, Randolph employed limitless charm and earnest passion with razor-sharp wit and acid sarcasm. His agile spontaneity and mastery of data made him a formidable member of the House of Commons and a model for the young Winston Churchill. Winston would read his father's speeches and even commit both his words and his mannerisms to memory. It's interesting because there's a quote from one of Winston Churchill's cousins who said, "No father did less for his son, and no son did more for his father." Winston Churchill would idolize his father. He wanted to be like his father. He admired him so greatly. And his father, we would find, would have significant disdain and dismissal of his own son. As a student who struggled with Latin, Churchill could never get around the notion that he's supposed to address a table in Latin by saying, "O table." And he says, "I would never address a table. Why would I say "O table" to a table?" He struggled with Latin, but Churchill fell in love with the English language. He committed 1,200 lines of English historian Thomas Babington Macaulay's The Lays of Ancient Rome to memory, and he won the school award for recitation of that same poem. As the Etruscans pressed upon the gates of Rome, Churchill would recite, "Then out spake brave Horatius, the captain of the gate, to every man upon this earth death cometh soon or late, and how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods. In his later years, Churchill would insist, the only thing I would whip schoolboys for is not knowing English, and I would whip them hard for that. As a young soldier posted in India, Churchill established what he described as the University of One. This is a perfect example of an autodidact, where he read boxes and boxes of books sent to him upon his request to his mother. Those books would include Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Macaulay's Histories of England, Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, and he'd even read the speeches of Cromwell, Pitt, and Gladstone, these lions of the prime minister role in England. In addition, Churchill would read countless bills from the House of Commons annual register. And what he would do is he'd have his mother send him boxes and boxes of the annual register, which contained all the bills of the House of Commons. And he would write speeches in favor of the bill, speeches in opposition of the bill, and then he would actually read the speeches that were given in the House of Commons. Constantly, Churchill was refining his language mastery. When Churchill was a young man of 23, he noted in his unpublished essay, The Scaffolding of Rhetoric, quote, "Of all the talents bestowed upon men, none is so precious as the gift of oratory. He who enjoys it wields a power more durable than that of a great king. He's an independent force in the world, abandoned by his party, betrayed by his friends, stripped of his offices. Whoever can command this power is still formidable." Now, this was said or written in 1897, before Churchill ever had any position in office. Incredible foreshadowing, not only of Churchill as an orator, but also of his time in the wilderness, basically abandoned by so many, and him rising up in the midst of it. Churchill credited the New York Congressman Bork Cochran as one of the great oratorical influences in his life. Cochran was a spellbinding speaker whom Churchill both studied and consulted over years of correspondence. He said, "It was an American statesman who inspired me and taught me how to use every note of the human voice like an organ. He was my model. I learned from him how to hold thousands in thrall." Churchill once commented on Congressman Bork Cochran, saying, "From what I've seen, I know that there are few more fascinating experiences than to watch a great mass of people under the wand of the magician. There is no gift so rare or so precious as the gift of oratory, so difficult to define or impossible to acquire." So there's something about Churchill that recognizes at a very, very early age that the capacity to understand language, to utilize it in a masterful way, can gather crowds around great causes, great issues, or great concerns, and they could be employed for ill or for good. Churchill adored the works of William Shakespeare. He committed at least 5 full plays. Richard Burton, the great Shakespearean actor, says a dozen. He committed at least 5 full plays to memory, and alluding to innumerable more throughout his speaking career. He once flustered Richard Burton, again, the great Shakespearean actor, when Burton was playing Hamlet. What happened here is that Churchill was at the end of his prime minister's career, but he was a famous man, obviously, all throughout England. And he comes in late. Hamlet had already started. He comes to a center spot, sits down, and Richard Burton tells a story that as Richard Burton is acting as Hamlet, he hears a rumbling voice going throughout, and he realizes it's Winston Churchill reciting the entire play as he himself is acting it out. And Burton says, "I'm trying to go faster," and he goes with me. "I try to go slower," he goes with me. And he said he ultimately missed a line, and Churchill erupted with anger and curse words. Churchill knew his Hamlet and knew it well, and it was intimidating to as great of an actor as Richard Burton. Now, Churchill always wrote his own speeches, which he either dictated or wrote out longhand. In 1904, he offered a speech from memory. He lost his place, and he sat down unable to recover. He said it was disconcerting to the last degree, and thus he always worked from a written text, and with the sentences triple-spaced and laid out like a psalm, not in prose form, with staggered lines and breaks in the text, so that he could pause and emphasize with the breaks in the lines. His parliamentary private secretary would recall, When Winston was taking trouble with a great speech, it worked out to be an hour of preparation per minute of delivery. And it was nothing for him but hard work. Then came the skill of pretending, of looking as if it was coming off the top of his head. Churchill was a relentless reviser, with numerous drafts and final drafts retyped on notepaper. And those notepaper, which were small size sheets, likewise had scribbles and words crossed out. He paced and he rehearsed when he was working on a speech. He repeated passages again and again for exact cadence and perfect timing. One time, his valet burst into the bathroom when he heard Mr. Churchill offering ominous murmurings. Churchill looked at him with surprise and said, "I wasn't talking to you, Norman. I was addressing the House of Commons." Now, even some of Churchill's witty ripostes were carefully planned in advance and tucked away for an opportune moment. Asked by Lord Mountbatten about a particularly creative insult, Churchill smiled wryly. "Patience, Dickie. I've been waiting years to get that one off." Churchill was intent on telling his audiences the truth, even if it was a bitter pill to swallow. "One must not yield too easily to the weaknesses of audiences," Churchill said. There they were, he added. What could they do? They had asked for it, and now they must have it. And at one point, Churchill insisted, "United wishes and goodwill cannot overcome brute facts. Truth is incontrovertible. Panic may resent it, ignorance may deride it, malice may distort it, but there it is." We would see the foreshadowing of that style of truth-telling in one of Churchill's most famous speeches he offered in his first speech after becoming prime minister, when he said, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." He gave to them the notion that this is a hardship we're about to endure, and suffering is coming. And it was one of the first times during that period that a prime minister had leveled with people about how bad things were, but people actually appreciated being leveled with. Churchill would rise in politics to great heights, including becoming the First Lord of the Admiralty, the head of the largest navy in the world during the First World War at the tender age of 40. This was in large part due to his intelligence, his political maneuvering, and especially his gifted oratory. Now, let's turn to Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler's father, Alois, was an angry and abusive man. A customs official, he had no time for oratory, nor did he want his son to engage in anything other than work as a civil servant. Adolf would have none of that. And after his father died, he pursued his dream, a dream dashed with 2 rejections. He wanted to become an artist through the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. So Hitler, being rejected by the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, would ultimately become a wanderer, a drifter, effectively, ultimately homeless. He would squander his inheritance. He would descend into bitter vagrancy, and he'd begin his formative oratorical education by happenstance in Vienna, imbibing the writings and the demagoguery of politicians, philosophers, and musicians. So one thing I'm going to stop and just make a mention of here is that you never quite know who's going to influence you in your life. And sometimes things happen just by chance, and other times you go seeking and searching out. In Adolf Hitler's particular situation, he was a cauldron of anger at having been raised by an abusive father. He was also very temperamental to begin with, and then to be rejected by the art school in Vienna, he felt like a great master had been turned away, and now he just seethed with resentments. And so he was drawn to, but also pulled in by, the rhetoric of people who also seethed with resentments. So who are some of those people? So the Austrian parliamentarian George Ritter von Schoner. Now he championed vicious anti-Semitism, ardent pan-Germanism, pulling the German people together who are broken up by these various arbitrary lines drawn on maps. So he wanted to reunite all the ethnic Germans that spilled over into Austria, spilled over into Czechoslovakia and other places. So Schoner was anti-Semitic, pan-Germanic, and he was an unrepentant scapegoater. Find your enemies and blame them. Schoner was the first to be addressed as Führer and to answer to Heil. So if you think about Hitler and some of what he was or what he became, he borrowed a lot of things by people who inspired him. Hitler learned the power of rallies, pageantry, and inflammatory rhetoric from this bombastic politician. Karl Lueger. He was the mayor of Vienna and an anti-Marxist, an anti-Semite, and a critic of those controlling the capital and the media. He demonstrated to Hitler the means to rally popular discontent by appealing to the common man's interest and portraying himself as a messianic figure. And then, of course, there was Richard Wagner. Many people are familiar with Wagner. He was the German composer, the conductor, and the essayist, best known for his opera such as The Ring Cycle and songs like The Ride of the Valkyrie, which I know I grew up listening to on the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner show. You can tell that's my sophistication level that I bring here. Hitler said, when I hear Wagner, it seems to me that I hear rhythms of a bygone world. Wagner showed Hitler how to emotionally overwhelm an audience with a collective nationalist experience. As Hitler biographer Ian Kershaw noted, betrayal, sacrifice, redemption, and heroic death were Wagnerian themes. Think about that. Think about the life of Hitler, talking about betrayal, sacrifice, redemption, and heroic death. Hitler, the non-entity, the mediocrity, the failure, wanted to live like a Wagnerian hero. He wanted to become himself a new Wagner, the philosopher king, the genius, the supreme artist. After fighting for Germany, being injured, and losing in the First World War, Hitler was demoralized. What he basically said was that Germany, the great German people, the blood and soil, the folk, and we'll talk about the folk of Germany, basically was betrayed. And they were betrayed by two entities, and those were the Jews and the Bolsheviks. So he felt like the war collapsing and Germany surrendering was one of the great catastrophes of the 20th century. So after the war was over, Hitler worked for the military to monitor radical parties emerging in the post-war chaos. Attending one particular meeting of the German Workers' Party, Hitler found himself not dispassionate like he was supposed to be, not an impartial observer working on behalf of the army. He found himself entranced with the topics discussed. And then he began passionately speaking. And then he joined the party within 2 days, and in a short period of time, he would lead the party with his fiery tirades and unmatched charisma. All at once, Hitler wrote, I was offered an opportunity of speaking before a large audience. And the thing that I had always presumed from pure feeling, without knowing it, was now corroborated. I could speak. And so here's Hitler discovering the power of oratory, but also the absolute exhilaration that comes from using the word to hold it over, lord it over, if you will, the masses and move them and bend them to your will. Historian Ian Kershaw went on to explain what Hitler did was to advertise unoriginal ideas in an original way. It was less what he said than how he said it that counted. Simplicity and repetition were two ingredients in his speaking armory. The nationalization of the masses, the reversal of the great betrayal of 1918, the surrender of the Germans, the destruction of Germany's internal enemies, above all, the removal of the Jews, and material and psychological rebuilding as the prerequisite for external struggle and the attainment of a position of world power. One of the things you'll find when it comes to great oratory, whether it's great oratory from a malevolent figure like Hitler or a more benevolent figure like Churchill, is how much they learn from and utilize skills that are now used in advertising. It was all of I think it was Freud's cousin who was a master at public relations and at advertising, and that was coming out, the psychology of the consumer and how to bend the consumer towards a product's or a company's will. That was all coming out in the 1920s. If you read Joseph Goebbels, who was the minister of propaganda under Hitler, and what he says about how to basically draw people in and what Hitler employed, it's incredible how much of that is effectively used in advertising. Hitler became so intoxicated with speaking that he studied the styles of rival party leaders and even mugged and posed in front of mirrors and cameras. Hitler's childhood friend, August Kubitschek, wrote that, quote, Hitler showed a gift for oratory from his earliest youth, and he knew it. Sometimes when he soared too high in his fantasies, I could not help suspecting that all this was nothing but an exercise in oratory. There is something about both Churchill and Hitler that love to hear themselves talk and love to get caught up in the movement, caught up in the meaning, and caught up in the cause and the passion of it, and to feel the power surge up within them that makes them excited, and they in turn make others excited around them. In Hitler's speeches, which he composed himself, he would dictate to secretaries, usually late before he was about to go and give a speech, maybe the night before or 2 nights before. He would dictate to secretaries while envisioning the crowd's reaction. He donned his military uniform to offer an impression of power and authority. He worked tirelessly to master timing, gestures, rhythm of speech. Hitler could mesmerize. He could memorize too, holding audiences spellbound for hours. He'd give talks for 2 or 3 hours at a time, and people stood or sat at the edge of their seat. And choreography mattered. The proper lighting, the stark contrast of the red and white and black swastika flag against stone pillars, a late entrance to a speech, a quick exit. Hitler privately called himself the greatest actor in Europe. And even the Nazi architect and the economic wunderkind, Albert Speer, confessed upon surrender in 1945, so now the end has come. That's good. It was all only a kind of opera anyway. Hitler once crowed, quote, "At that time, I adopted the standpoint, it makes no difference whatever. Whenever they laugh at us or revile us, whether they represent us as clowns or criminal, the main thing is that they mention us, that they concern themselves with us again and again." Again, going back to the old advertising saw, there's no such thing as bad publicity. Hitler would continue, "The power which has always started the greatest religious and political avalanches in history has been from time immemorial none but the magic power of the word." Over the next decade, Hitler would form the Nazi Party and attempt to violently overthrow the German Bavarian government in the failed 1923 beer hall putsch. Put on trial with a sympathetic judge, he was given a platform to excoriate the government and promote his folkish, that is German nationalist, blood and soil ideology. Hitler would boast, "I consider myself not a traitor, but a German who desired what was best for his people." After a short, cushy jail sentence, he basically, for a treasonous attempt to overthrow the nation, he got 5 years of a sentence, and he served about 8.5 months. And he was effectively in a hotel room with the secretary, who was Rudolf Hess, who ultimately was one of his minions that served with him up until 1940, 1941. And that's where he dictated his work, Mein Kampf, which meant my struggle. So in his short, cushy jail sentence, he'd be released, and now Hitler would rebuild the Nazi Party and strive to achieve total power legally. And this is one of the important things about understanding Hitler and his rise to power. What he could not achieve illegally and violently in 1923, he achieved legally through parliamentary means and democratic means in 1933. So the decade of the 20s would end, and a new decade would begin with worldwide economic depression and the fortunes of the radical National Socialists catapulted to power. Another note about radical parties thrive in chaos. If people are out of work, if the economy is plunging, if there's all sorts of unrest, the radicals come in and offer a great plan to root and branch, take care of things, and transform things. When the economy is better, people have jobs, they feel safe, all of a sudden more cooler heads prevail and democracy starts to thrive. This was a time of great upheaval, and thus it was to the benefit of the radical National Socialists. So Hitler would be named German Chancellor in 1933, where he would suspend civil liberties, terrorize Jews, Catholics, communists, and other enemies, and consolidate power for future conquest. It's always interesting when you look at like a president's first 100 days. Read about the first 60 days of what Hitler did when he took office as a chancellor. It's striking in terms of his suspension of civil liberties, of his outlawing of other parties. Of course, there was the Reichstag fire, which led people to believe there was a communist insurrection. So that was a pretext for the Nazis to really consolidate power. But it's frightening. It's truly frightening to see what he did in his first 60 days. So again, he would suspend civil liberties, terrorize Jews, Catholics, communists, other enemies, consolidate power for future conquest. His goal was to reunify the German-speaking peoples, conquer the enemy France, and establish living space, known as Lebensraum, in the East, while enslaving or killing inferior races while propagating the eugenic German Superman. Now, Churchill, on the other hand, would find himself not at the peak of his power, but effectively out of power. Because Churchill, from the time he started in Parliament in 1900 until 1929, he effectively rose like a rocket, having changed parties 3 times, mind you, went from liberal to conservative to liberal, back to conservative. And he had all sorts of ministerial posts, like cabinet posts. But the 1930s, because of his warnings about Hitler, his support of the king during the abdication crisis, and also his opposition to the independence of India, he became sort of a persona non grata, if you will, and he was cast into the parliamentary wilderness years. He was just a lowly member of parliament. So after, and also after a debacle, just to reiterate this, after a debacle in the First World War, when he was the Lord of the Admiralty and some terrible mission on the Eastern Front went badly, he was removed from power. In the 1920s, in those various ministry posts, he would rise to the height of being a British chancellor, the most powerful government position next to prime minister. It was actually the position his father had achieved, the highest position his father had achieved. But moving into the 1930s, Churchill fell back into the powerless political wilderness and watched with grim frustration the rapid rise of the Nazis and the feckless response of the Western democracies. They are preparing for war, Churchill observed in a report from his aide, Duff Cooper, with more general enthusiasm, that is the Germans, than a whole nation has ever before put into such preparation. The philosophy of bloodlust is being inculcated into their youth in a manner unparalleled since the days of barbarism. In a speech to the German Reichstag on May 17, 1933, barely 4 months into his chancellorship, Hitler fumed, "All the problems which are causing such unrest today lie in the deficiencies of the Versailles Treaty of Peace, which did not succeed in solving in a clear and reasonable way the questions of the most decisive importance for the future. Neither national nor economic, to say nothing of legal problems and demands of the nations, were settled by this treaty in such a way as to stand the criticism of reason in the future. It is therefore natural that the idea of revision of the Versailles Treaty is not only one of the constant accompaniments of the effects of this treaty, but that it is actually foreseen as necessary by the authors of the treaty, and therefore given a legal foundation in the treaty itself." So you might say, what are you talking about? What's the Versailles Treaty? The Versailles Treaty was basically the treaty agreed upon by the Allies, the French and the Americans and others, the Brits, about Germany basically accepting complete war guilt, Germany being stripped of its armaments, Germany being deprived of having a military, and effectively paying reparations. And history has debated quite widely, but largely fallen on the notion, upon the conclusion that it was pretty punitive. And by being as punitive as it was against the Germans, it fostered such anger and resentment that it only likely increased the risk that a radical group would come out of this and create problems in the future. So what I'd like to do, and this is one of the few slides I have that actually shows words, because I think pictures are pretty effective. I wanted to show you what happened in 1919. We're going to go back to what the Versailles Treaty said, and then we want to talk about what Hitler did in his first months of office to defy the Versailles Treaty. So I'm just going to go over it. I'm going to walk over here for a minute. The Versailles Treaty demanded that there was a complete acceptance of war guilt, and Hitler was belligerent. It said that the Germans had to pay reparations to victors. Hitler stopped payments. It said there would be no heavy military artillery or tanks in 1934. Hitler would establish a tank fleet. There'd be minimal army with little turnover. In 1935, Hitler would mandate a draft. There was to be no Air Force. In 1935, Hitler develops an Air Force. There was to be minimal naval fleet and no submarines. Hitler develops the U-boats, that is the subfleet, clandestinely and ultimately openly in a naval agreement with the English. And finally, the Germans were to relinquish colonies and many territories. And as we'll talk about, in 1936 and 1938, Hitler starts reacquiring. There wasn't a big secret that these were frank and brazen defiances of the Versailles Treaty. And yet the appetite that the Brits and the French had for the possible descent into a war like what they'd experienced in the trenches of World War I, it was unthinkable. And so there was just enough of a notion that just let them do their thing. They'll become equal with us. What's the worst thing in the world? There was not a will to check this. And obviously, in that lack of a will is where things started going wrong. So as I said, I'm going to move to one more slide. Because we need to know this too. What's going on in Britain at the time that Germany is resurging in this fashion? The Brits are cutting funding for their military. By 1938, the Germans had septupled. They went from 7 to 46 infantry divisions and from 3 horse-drawn cavalry divisions to 5 tank divisions and 3,000 combat aircraft. Just to give you a comparison, Britain had 6 infantry, the Germans had 46, and 1 tank division spread throughout the empire, and the German Air Force has now eclipsed both the French and the British Air Forces combined. Now, this is a existential, I know we use the word existential threat, but this was an existential threat because this was a belligerent, unapologetic, angry Germany on the heels of the Versailles Treaty that is now outstripping the capacity of the Brits and the French and the other allies from keeping them in a box. So Hitler flagrantly defied and violated the terms of the Versailles Treaty, and no one did anything about it. In September of 1934, Hitler fawned over himself at a Nuremberg rally, again, utilizing his oratorical capacity. That is the miracle of our age, that you have found me, among so many millions, and that I have found you. That is Germany's great fortune, Hitler would say. On August 17th of 1934, Hitler spoke at Hamburg City Hall saying, "We have malicious enemies in the world. Do what we might, a certain international conspiracy will stop at nothing to interpret it as something bad. They permanently subsist on the sole hope that our folk, our blood and soil, our nation might once again drown in inner discord. We know our fate throughout the centuries all too well to overlook the consequences." And in a speech offered to the House of Commons on November 28, 1934, Churchill warned, "Do not delude yourselves. Do not let His Majesty's government believe that all Germany is asking for is equal status. That is not what Germany is seeking. All these bands of sturdy Teutonic youths marching through the streets and roads of Germany with the light of desire in their eyes to suffer for their fatherland, they are not looking for status. They are looking for weapons. The turning point has been reached, and the new steps must be taken. The scene has changed. This terrible new fact has occurred. Germany is arming. She is rapidly arming, and no one will stop her." Churchill was dismissed. He was dismissed as a warmonger, as misreading Germany's intentions, and he would not cease saying what he saw before his very eyes, because Churchill was a truth teller on this. So I'm going to show you a map here. Now, forgive me, this map is actually a little bit wrong, but we're going to just so you can just imagine this. We're going to talk about, this is all Germany right here. And there's this area right here called the Rhineland. There's this area down south called Austria, and there's the western portion called Czechoslovakia. Germany is in the center. This is actually a post-war, so just ignore the borders that you're seeing there. In March of 1936, Adolf Hitler brazenly moved a small contingent of soldiers who would have been easily repulsed by the 300,000 strong French army into the demilitarized Rhineland between France and Germany. Now so Germany's right here, and they move into this demilitarized zone between France and Germany. They had about 30 to 40,000, effectively like policemen, that would have been just flicked right away if the French military would have just come in there and crushed them. When he moved in there, he gave this speech at the Reichstag, the German parliament, and he said, "In accordance with the fundamental right of a nation to secure its frontiers and ensure its possibilities of defense, the German government has today restored the full and unrestricted sovereignty of Germany in the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland. We have no territorial claims to make in Europe. We know above all that all the tensions resulting either from false territorial settlements or from the disproportion of the number of inhabitants to their living spaces cannot in Europe be solved by war. Classic Hitler. So Hitler would brag about what he had just done to really rally the people in his audience, the Germans, the hard-bitten Nazis, etc., and others that were on the fence about things. And then he would say to the international community, he'd send a message and say, but we want no more war. I mean, you wouldn't think about waging war, would you? Because I don't want war. We should have a peace treaty between us and England, between us and France. We should have a European conference and a pact about things. So it would give the allies that were reluctant to push back against him, but needed sort of an out for seeming like they're being inactive, it'd give them an excuse. Well, listen, we can maybe get a good deal out of this. And who's to say this wasn't Germany's to begin with, right? And it doesn't concern us. We're way over here. It's not a problem. But Churchill was having none of it. Churchill fumed. The government simply cannot make up their minds. And so they go on in strange paradox. Decided only to be undecided, resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, all powerful to be impotent. In less than 2 years, we have this scene. Hitler's Nazis marched into and bloodlessly annexed Austria, claiming to be reunifying ancient German peoples. Now, I want to say something briefly about this. Before this happened, Hitler had met with some upper-level British figures. One was Lord Halifax, who was a foreign minister. They went on a fox hunt. Halifax kind of thought the Nazis weren't so bad. I mean, he's a complicated guy. But the long and the short of it is they said, what would you think about us redrawing some lines? Because the German peoples need to be reunited after all these arbitrary lines. And Halifax effectively said, if certain changes were to evolve, we wouldn't necessarily say we had to call upon you to change those changes. It was just kind of this diplo speak that effectively said we tacitly would accept that without doing anything about it. Well, the Nazis were very happy to know that the Brits would be willing to do nothing about that. And so they stirred up some trouble in Austria and decided to say, we need to help out because there's trouble in Austria and our German folk are being treated poorly. We need to come to the rescue. We're going to rescue you from the very trouble we are causing. So in 1938, Hitler's Nazis marched into bloodlessly annexed Austria and claiming to be reunifying again the ancient German peoples. Now, just going back for 1 second, I want to go back to that map. Hitler has now extended into the Rhineland and now taken over all of Austria. They have massively increased their real estate. So Hitler at this time is in this picture. He's basically giving a speech from the Hofburg Palace, the famous palace of the Habsburgs in Vienna. And he declares, I proclaim herewith for this land its new mission, a strict command for all Germans. The most thoroughly German outpost of the German people shall from henceforth be the newest bulwark of the German nation and therefore the German Reich. By the way, I also want to clarify Reich. Reich is rule, it's empire. The Third Reich would follow the First Reich, which was the 1,000-year rule of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Second Reich, which was Bismarck's from 1871 to 1914. Hitler said the Third Reich would be 1,000 years once again. Hitler would go on. Through centuries in troubled times of the past, storms of the East have broken on the border of the old Eastern outpost. But in centuries to come, for all time, there shall be an iron guarantee for the security and freedom of the Germanic Reich, and therewith a guarantee for the happiness and peace of our great people. And so he's effectively saying, first of all, Germans welcome home, which doesn't say much about the non-Germans because they're not going to be treated so well. And secondly, he says, this is effectively our new fortress, and we're going to be effectively making moats around us to repel invasions when in fact, Hitler's not going to stay put. He's going to keep expanding. Churchill's beside himself. He's beside himself. He's addressing the House of Commons. He says, for 5 years, I have talked to the House on these matters, not with very great success. I've watched this famous island descending incontinently, fecklessly, the stairway which leads to a dark gulf. It is a fine broad stairway at the beginning, but after a bit, the carpet ends. A little further on, there are only flagstones. A little further on still, these flagstones break beneath your feet. If mortal catastrophe should overtake the British nation, historians 1,000 years hence will never understand how it was that the victorious nation suffered themselves to cast away all that they had gained by measureless sacrifice. We'd won World War I only to give it up to this kooky radical who runs Germany, and we're giving it to him for free. Now the victors are vanquished, the Brits, the French, the Austrians, in this case now. Now the victors are vanquished, and those who threw down their arms are striding on to world mastery. And now we move on to probably one of the most infamous moments in diplomatic history. At a Nuremberg rally in September of 1938, Hitler insisted that his patience was at an end. He wanted to be handed the Sudetenland. Now, I'm going to scroll back to the map for a second. Again, disregard the markings. Germany, the Rhineland, Austria. Here's Czechoslovakia. Western Czechoslovakia is known as the Sudetenland. Had a large number of ethnic Germans there, but it also happened to be conveniently the most militarily fortified part of Central Europe. And it just so happened that Hitler wanted it. And he once again made a pretext. The Germans are suffering relentlessly under the yoke of the Czechs. It's terrible. We must go in there and liberate them. He demanded it. He says, as a National Socialist and as a German soldier, I enter upon this struggle with a stout heart. My whole life has been nothing but one long struggle for my people, for its restoration, and for Germany. There was only one watchword for that struggle: faith in this people. One word I have never learned, and that is surrender. We are all faithful to our old principle. It is quite unimportant whether we ourselves live, but it is essential that our people shall live, that Germany shall live. The sacrifice that is demanded of us is not greater than the sacrifice that many generations have made. If we form a community closely bound together by vows, ready for anything, resolved never to surrender, then our will master every hardship and difficulty. And I would like to close with the declaration that I once made when I began the struggle for power in the Reich. I then said, if our will is so strong that no hardship and suffering can subdue it, then our will and our Germany might prevail. German might shall prevail. Once again, one has to recognize, like the Brits and the French and others who did not want to engage in war like trench warfare of World War I. And as an example, in the Battle of the Somme in France, 58,000 British soldiers were killed in one day. One day. An entire generation was wiped clean from the face of the earth, and they did not want to have that. But the Germans, while they lost immense numbers of people too, this was a marshaling of the spirit. And there was a sense about the notion that the folk, the blood and soil, the nationalism of Germany was the great power in the world, was destined for greatness. And here's a guy who came into this milieu that was effectively messianic, that could lead us out of it. And guess what? In the face of the great powers that had defeated Germany and Austria in the First World War, he had brazenly taken the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland, all of Austria, and is now demanding the western portion of Czechoslovakia. And he's getting what he wants. Maybe there's something to this guy. Maybe this is our deliverer. That's the message in Germany. Maybe we're going to come out of our economic paralysis, our humiliation, and rise to the mighty place that we belong here on earth. Well, in a craven act of appeasement, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Edouard Daladier handed that territory, Western Czechoslovakia, and by the way, without really consulting the president of Czechoslovakia, Edvard Beneš, they handed it to the demanding Führer. Churchill warned, Neville had the choice between war and dishonor. He chose dishonor, and he will get war anyway. Speaking on October 5th, 1938 to the House of Commons, Churchill was apoplectic. I will begin, he said, by saying what everybody would like to ignore or forget, but which must nevertheless be stated, namely that we have sustained a total and unmitigated defeat, and that France has suffered even more than we have. And I will say this, that I believe the Czechs, left to themselves and told they were going to get no help from the Western powers, would have been able to make better terms than they have got. They could hardly have had worse after all this tremendous perturbation. All is over. Czechoslovakia recedes into the darkness. She has suffered in every respect by her association with the Western democracies and with the League of Nations, of which she has always been an obedient servant. Many people, no doubt, honestly believe that they are only giving away the interests of Czechoslovakia, whereas I fear we shall find that we have deeply compromised and perhaps fatally endangered the safety and even the independence of Great Britain and France. There can never be friendship between the British democracy and the Nazi power. That power can never be, they cannot ever be the trusted friend of the British democracy. He would conclude saying, our brave and loyal people should know the truth. They should know that there has been gross neglect and deficiency in our defenses. They should know that we have sustained a defeat without a war, the consequences of which will travel far with us along our road. They should know that we have passed an awful milestone in our history when the whole equilibrium of Europe has been deranged and the terrible words have for the time being been pronounced against the Western democracies. Thou art weighed in the balance and found wanting. And do not suppose, he said in conclusion, that this is the end. This is only the beginning of the reckoning. Indeed, this act of appeasement would later cause Hitler to privately confess, our enemies are little worms. I saw them at Munich. The war of words between the two master orators had only begun, and the war of their nations loomed on the ever-approaching horizon. Tomorrow, we will explore in our final session, Churchill and Hitler, the decisive war of words. Thank you very much.
Wow, it's a compelling
story. Are you
story.
Exhausted, Matt?
Don't tell me how it ends. Tune in tomorrow. Well, we have many questions. We could put them in different categories, but let's start with some sort of biographical and historical questions. So one strand of that is our members want to know more about sort of the influences, the ideological influences, and in particular the religious influences, if any, that set sort of the context for Churchill on one side and Hitler on the other. What were those influences?
Really good. So Churchill or Hitler, and this is one thing I especially want our listeners to understand, because this is where the same thing happens with Stalin, the same that happens with Hitler and some other terrible people in history. Hitler was raised initially as a Catholic, and he was in a school that he was being formed, a Catholic school. But Hitler very clearly early on walked away from his Catholic faith. So anybody who wants to say, well, Hitler was a Catholic and wants to make these kind of very, very slanderous kind of notions that somehow Hitler and Catholicism go hand in hand are not studying the history that they were studying. What Hitler did was he jettisoned his faith, whatever there was of it to begin with, and he moved instead into the secular religion of, again, German folkish nationalism. But what I will say about Hitler is he's canny. And how is he canny? He's canny in the sense that he recognized a certain amount of the choreography, the brilliant, ingenious and spirit-led choreography of the Catholic Church, which does, funeral masses and papal, the naming of the popes when it comes to conclave and things of that nature. It's gorgeous what is done. Hitler co-opted that stuff for the Nazi Party. It was basically saying, we're going to make this look like a religion. And some said, Speer was one of them. He said, it seems like what he's doing is a rite of a religion. And in fact, it was a secular religion. So Hitler was a nominal Catholic who walked away fast from the Catholic faith, drank deep of the draughts of blood and soil folkish nationalism as a religion, whereas Himmler, his totally weird and brutal, ruthless concentration camp master, was into all sorts of strange mystical stuff and so on. But Hitler co-opted aspects of the presentation of Catholicism and the dogmas and so on and so forth into his National Socialist creed. Churchill was raised effectively a golden rule sort of soft Anglican, but he was never really a strong believer, which is very interesting. I would call Churchill an agnostic. And it's funny because I think it was the Archbishop of Canterbury that once criticized Churchill and say, no, Winston, we wouldn't necessarily call you a pillar of the church. And he says, Churchill said, I like to consider myself more like a flying buttress. I support her from the outside. The thing about Churchill, though, is he recognized legitimately the role that Christianity had in edifying all of Western civilization, edifying all of democracy, and at its very base, the notion of the dignity of man, the dignity of woman, and the notion of fallibility and redemption. And he would make references to, whether my creator, whether I'm prepared to meet my creator, I believe I am, but whether he is ready for that particular toilsome task, I'm not sure. He'd make these off-putting kind of comments. One can never know the state of any one man's soul, but the long and the short of it is there is so much of Churchill's rhetoric and the way he lived his life and the things he stood for that truly reflected elements of an Anglican Christianity, but he never went fully in, because I think he was a little bit subdued by the notion of an enlightened, rationalistic, early 20th century creed, if you will.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. With regards to the question of Hitler's Catholicism, so and people were asking about this, that's oftentimes used as a cudgel against the church. Another cudgel related to that is, well, okay, let's say Hitler wasn't influenced by his Catholicism and becoming who he became, but the Catholic Church in Germany sort of allowed it to happen or was passive during Hitler's rise. Can you speak to that question? I know that's a tome in and of itself, but help our members to understand, what was the Catholic Church doing at this time in Germany?
First of all, I would say it was complicated in the sense that the turmoil in Germany was massive. There was a fear of radical communism, which was very virulently anti-Christian, anti-Catholic. There was a fear of radical National Socialism, but the National Socialists, first of all, presented themselves for a time as an ally of the church, and second of all, as a bulwark against godless communism. Third of all, there was a book written called Hitler's Pope by John Cornwell that I read as a Protestant, because I'm like, let's give it to the Catholics and so on, only to come to realize that it's terribly sourced. It had an axe to grind, and it got immense publicity because it was just anti-Catholic. It's propaganda. And Pius XII, there's no question that there were Catholics. I'm not talking about Pius XII. Actually, archival data comes out about Pius XII that is much more exculpatory, if that's the right word, of Pius XII than all the things that people say were damning of him. Now, were there certain factions out there, cardinals of this or that helped spirit Nazis out through the rat lines to South America? Yeah, there were. But the other thing is the notion of a concordat, and the concordat is a political agreement between the Vatican and the churches and ruling leaders. Same concordat kind of thing happened with Mussolini, and it was a notion that it was a diplomat. The Vatican has a diplomatic corps, and part of the diplomatic corps was the notion of saying, we want to be able to teach our children, run our schools, and so on and so forth. That was part of natural parlay across diplomatic circles from the beginning of the Vatican's and role as a political entity as well as a Catholic entity into the modern era. So what I would simply say is what you've heard about Catholics just carrying the water for Hitler is vastly overblown, number one. Number two is, were there Catholics that carried the water? 100% there were. But what I'd say, this should be a whole talk, well, maybe this will be next year, but the whole talk about the heroic leaders and the heroic workers within the Catholic faith on behalf of Jews, on behalf of the Allies, and so on and so forth. It's legion. It just doesn't get the airtime per se. So I'd say it's complicated. It's not lily white. There's no question. But the story of it being Catholics allied with Hitler, just bar none, is just not true. But there are some complicated engagements that I think are worthy of discussion. But one shouldn't judge until we go into the depths of that.
You've already given us so much to explore, which we will get to in terms of abstracting lessons about the power of oratory its ethical, unethical use, and we'll get to that. But still, questions on the genealogy, the ideological genealogy. So anti-Semitism remains a problem today, and you touched upon it in your presentation. But what was the fuel that anti-Semitism provided within the rise of Hitler? What was its function?
Yeah. It's interesting because, as you know, Bishop Barron and Father Steve have spoken at length about Rene Girard and the scapegoating phenomena, the mimetic desire, mimetic rivalry, and scapegoating. The Jews were represented throughout history as the other. And in many respects, I think a number of things. Number one is their role in Scripture, with respect to the Pharisees and the crucifixion and so on of Christ. But we also have to remember the disciples and Jesus himself were Jewish. So you can't draw these bright lines and say, this is the Jews did just this. But I think there was this long-standing notion among certain vehemently anti-Semitic Christian circles that Jews are the Christ killers. So that's from the beginning, kind of going forward, that carries with it. Secondly, many Jews, not all of them, but many could thrive in a culture that is not their own. And in many ways, they became very successful, and they oftentimes went in certain economic paths and so on. Not always, but the bottom line is that was a tool for the people who wanted to gain power to say it's the Jews that are manipulating your money, that are overcharging in loans, that are Christ killers. They're alien to us. If you just look at the propaganda posters of Hitler's era, I mean, first of all, the Aryan, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, robust, strapping lad and the gorgeous German maiden, I mean, they're perfect. And then the almost kind of boil-infested and caricaturized features of a Jewish individual. It was to make them effectively be an other. And so I would say a longstanding religious anti-Semitism, the notion of a thriving population in whatever culture they can find themselves in many respects, as being a source of resentment, but also being a small enough minority and a minority that didn't necessarily have the power that they were said to have. They could be targeted and be rallied around as a nidus for resentment, and the pogroms and ultimately, obviously, the concentration camps would follow suit.
To the extent that we can abstract away from Hitlerism and Nazism in particular, to maybe sort of a kind of totalitarianism, what is the role of scapegoat? Do these ideologies need a scapegoat? And is the identification of scapegoat already sort of throwing up red flags that there's something dangerous here?
Yes, I think one of the greatest movements or the greatest needs of a totalitarian movement is getting voluntary unity. As we could go into the whole notion of the totalitarian societies, that they're not authoritarian, they're totalitarian. They don't want just you to stick to your knitting and just be quiet and believe your own things, but just let me have control. They want to get into your soul, which is why the communists would torture people and then put them on trial, not just for public consumption. They wanted that person to believe before they killed them. They wanted them to believe. They want to get down to that level, that level of control. So if you could have a scapegoat that could lead people to kind of go, yeah, you're right about that, as opposed to the heavy-handed totalitarian insinuation of this totalitarian culture into your life and making you believe or do certain things. If you could willfully be persuaded that those are people that are causing us problems and they should be held responsible and we should kick them out and we should smash their windows and force them to scrub the streets and send them on trains and so on and so forth. All of a sudden, by playing upon the passions of the people, those passions are doing your work for you in consolidating power within a totalitarian regime. So I think scapegoating effectively, if you look at most totalitarian regimes, scapegoating will be in almost every single one because it points to the other and it becomes a rallying point for people to say, we're on this side, they're on that side. And the totalitarian just smiles and says, my work is done here.
So looking at sort of the categorization questions, and with the, be very careful that we don't apply any lessons from history directly to the contemporary questions. There are queries about what is Nazism? Is it right wing? People say it's right wing. People say it's left wing. Communism appears to be left wing, and they were the enemies of Hitler.
Yeah.
So how are these categories even helpful?
Yeah.
for understanding what was
I
going
remember
on.
when watching my 8th grade teacher draw this kind of line, showing right, left, and so on, and then the Nazis and reactionaries are on this side, and it was the communist radicals were on that side. I look at it more as a circle, and I truly believe National Socialism and communism, they are very, very, very close to one another, and they're both secular religions. They both believe in the notion of the collective, where you have an economic collective on the part of the communists, and you have a racial collective on the part of the Nazis. They believe in totalitarianism, so getting down to the level of the soul. They're both enemies of religion. They both believe in significant militancy, if you will. They both believe in informing. They both believe in scapegoating, and they both have designs that transcend just their local areas. They always want to expand. They're imperialistic. So it's interesting because a lot of, if I could really press people, if you want to learn more about this, read The Dissidents, read Leszek Kolakowski, read Václav Havel, read Dietrich Bonhoeffer, read Dietrich von Hildebrand, and Alfred Delp, and so many of these great thinkers. Obviously, read Orwell, read Arthur Koestler. All these great works. They put their finger, John Paul II, they put their finger on the nature of the totalitarianism. And you see, it is a secular religion, bereft of the notion of the dignity of the individual. You are subservient to the movement. You are utilitarian. You are expendable. And the God is the will to power along this vein. It is Satan whispering in the ear of Adam and Eve, you shall be like gods. And that's what totalitarianism is. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. There was another historical question. We have many of them, but we will get to the actual questions of oratory as well, if not today,
yes,
certainly tomorrow as well. Curiosity about how, so when we're looking at Hitler's rise, there were centrists, right? There were those who seemed reasonable, and who recognized the problems of the German country, but certainly we're not interested in going a Hitlerian direction. How did he win them over before the iron fist came along, before the violence came along?
He read the room. And I think what I mean by that is that John Lukács, who wrote 5 Days in London, May 1940, wonderful, wonderful book. He also wrote a book called The Duel, the 80-day struggle between Hitler and Churchill. Fantastic, fantastic. John Lukács, Lukacs. You should read those books. He talked about the notion that there were few people in the 20th century that could read human nature on a vast historical level like Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler. And if you look at Hitler, for instance, and I'll get back to the centrist people, he looked at the Brits and the French leadership and recognized they don't have an appetite for war, but I can't be so belligerent as to not give them a little bit of an out. So I'll just take bite-sized, I'll make promises I won't keep. I'll take bite-sized areas or larger. I'll take them, and then right away I'll ask for a deal, a peace deal, because that's what they want. They want an excuse not to have to do something about it. The inertia, they recognize the inertia. Well, likewise, domestically, like I said, when times are tough and chaos reigns, the radicals rise because people want relief and they want it now. And the slow-moving older kind of statesman, kind of parliamentary process that rules very, very slowly is not satisfactory enough. And so Hitler and the communists will basically say, we should throw all these people out and we can take over and do things really with a little bit of strength and not a whole lot of red tape. We can get things done. That's very attractive to people. As that was rising up, the centrists, they were having a hard time selling their narrative. And the other thing is, a lot of the centrists said, well, Hitler's better than the other guys. And the communist people, there was a month when Munich was taken over by the communists. It was a horrible reign with summary executions and tortures and all this stuff. That 1 month of the Soviet Munich was used for, it just had so much momentum going forward as a pretext for, we can't go back to that. We can't go back to that. We can't go back to that. So I think A, there was a lack of inertia. B, the message for the centrists wasn't carrying on. C, there was a belief that maybe Hitler isn't as bad as we think he's going to be. And D, there probably a great degree of self-deception. I think it's going to turn out okay. And so I have some quotes in one of the talks I give about the Catholic Center Party basically justifying what Hitler's doing and saying we just got to go along with it right now for a time. It'll get better, but we just kind of got to go along with it for a time. And then he dissolved his party and they went away and they didn't come back for 12 years. So.
Do with the historical questions. They're just too fascinating.
Yeah.
So what was it about Churchill that gave him the kind of acuteness of insight to be able to see through it when so much of the world was in fact deceived, whether it was self-deception or they sincerely believed it was not going to be as bad as, or they just didn't want to deal with it? What was it about him that he could see it?
It's prescient, if you will, what he could see. One of my good friends says, Churchill was right in the big two things of the 20th century. He's right about the communists way back when. He wanted to go and shut the communists down during the Russian Civil War. He said Bolshevism should be strangled in its crib. And everybody said, Winston, we just finished World War I. We're not going over there. You're off on another one of your tears, if you will. He was right about that. He was right about Hitler. I don't know. I think it's inscrutable. These are the imponderables. How did he know? I mean, he was very, very well read, but it wasn't just that. I just think he was a student of history and a student of human nature. I think to some extent, his reading of his love of oratory and his understanding of what it takes to move a room and so on. Again, this is a very, very small fraction, but I think it still applies. I think that was so intriguing to him to know what might move a person this way and move a person that way, gave him an apprehension about the way people think and also the capacity for self-delusion, if you will. So I think it was incredible reading. I think he had unbelievable intuition that was honed, but it was also given to him, by God. Incredible instincts. And I think he came through great study to just better understand what moves people this way, what moves people that way. He was criticized as being kind of very impulsive and impetuous. One Lord Allenbrook, who was the chief of the Imperial General Staff, once said, Churchill has 10 ideas a day, one of them is good. He was very creative, and I think his creativity in part made him have his feelers out and his fingers on the pulse of the room, and that's similar to what Hitler had too. So I think that's what maybe served him in part. But this is a great question that ultimately I'll have an unsatisfactory answer, but all I can say is it was mesmerizing how he could read human nature, and he had blind spots, but also Hitler could read human nature and he had blind spots.
Is it historically accurate to say that he really was alone in seeing that at that time?
There's a great book out there called Troublesome Young Men, written by Lynn Olson. Lynn Olson also wrote a book called Hero of the Empire about Churchill being a prisoner during the Boer War. It's a great book. Troublesome Young Men shows the unheralded men and women that surrounded Churchill during that time and really kind of caught on. So Churchill was a leader of a small faction that ultimately grew. And it's a wonderful book because it also characterizes this guy named, I think it's David Margeson, who was the party whip, and Chamberlain, as ruthless politically, that they would destroy you. And some of these people, they were politically destroyed for allying themselves with Churchill, whereas Churchill was kind of Teflon for a little bit. So there were others. And I think also Mir Brennan der Sorge, written by Pope Pius XI, was effectively, I don't know if it was an encyclical, against National Socialism. And he also wrote one shortly before that on against atheistic communism. So the church, Dietrich von Hildebrand, way early was calling it out. So that's another reason why I'd say there's a lot of members of the church, intellectuals and otherwise, that put their finger on the pulse of, the church teaches us about human nature, our sinfulness, our brokenness, but also our ability to be redeemed and so on. That apprehension of human nature through the story of Christ, his disciples, and the saints and ourselves, I think also opens you up to say, what is it about this movement that runs afoul of what we believe? And it becomes a stark contrast. So again, those are more great sources. Churchill wasn't the only one, but he was the most prominent.
Sure. And so we will turn to the questions for oratory tomorrow. But as a final question, let's get this on the table now. As you know, there is this sort of revisionist movement that really has some steam behind it now to cast Churchill as a villain. Who unnecessarily got the UK into war, that the World War II, in fact, could have been avoided if he would have not been a warmonger. I see your reaction to that. Why, briefly, is that just so wrong?
Yeah, I think here's the thing. One has to then say they're satisfied with the notion that Hitler would have completed his project of the final solution. That Hitler can now run the concentration camps at full tilt and kill every last Jew Yeah, and by the way, and Catholics and Gypsies and anybody else who ran afoul. I mean, we're talking, and the notion of, great man theory of history and impersonal forces of history, it's both and. But the story of Winston Churchill in May of 1940 is a story of a great man who's got his own flaws and warts. I know the mail's going to come about, what about this? He's flawed, but the long and the short of it is, he was the one person who served as a nidus around which Britain, and then the United States, and then ultimately the Soviet Union and the rest of the world rallied to collapse collectively this man who wrought death and bloodshed. So the notion that, well, if Britain would be a better day if it would have stuck to its knitting and let Hitler run a show, think about the consequences of that. It would have been horrible. And by the way, he wouldn't have stopped there. He would have ultimately have co-opted the Brits and even the United States. I think he would have gone for world domination without question. So I think it's a shallow, sad argument that just doesn't hold water if you really want to take into consideration what the consequences would be.
Amen. Well, thank God we have day 2 tomorrow. So please join us, friends, tomorrow for day 2 of our seminar. We will really be looking at the question of oratory tomorrow, and we'll continue to take your questions. If you're watching on our YouTube channel right now, please consider joining us for day 2 on the Institute platform and all of the other offerings that we have by going to institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org, and you can easily sign up for a free 30-day trial. Thank you, friends. We'll see you again soon. God bless.